Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the December Conservative Women's Network. I'm Michelle Easton, the president of the Clare Boothe Luce Center for Conservative Women, and I want to thank you all for coming. And I want to thank the Heritage Foundation as well. Cora Weck is here from Heritage. Is Colleen here? Colleen is coming to be a co-host as well. We started this CWN when Becky Norton Dunlop was a vice president back in 1999, and then Bridget took over, and it's such a pleasure to work with Heritage on this program once a month. Now, the purpose of Conservative Women's Network is to highlight the most outstanding conservative women. But our regular attendees know that every December, for a special treat, we'd like to invite a distinguished gentleman like Ryan Anderson. And the women-only events are not because we don't like men. We do. Rather, we believe that if conservatives fail to highlight and promote our own outstanding women leaders, it allows the left to supplant them with far less significant feminist role models, of whom there are legions. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Ryan Anderson, who will be speaking on the effort to erase women. Ryan is the president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center and best-selling author of the book, When Harry Became Sally, Responding to the Transgender Movement. His book was removed from Amazon, of course, in 2021 after they had been selling it for a number of years. He has been on so many television programs and stations: Fox, ABC, CNN, CNBC, MSNBC, and his research has been cited repeatedly, especially by a couple of our best Supreme Court justices, Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas, in key Supreme Court cases. He's the co-author of 4 other books, including the just-released Tearing Us Apart: How Abortion Harms Everything and Solves Nothing, which discusses the catastrophic failures of legalized abortion. And we had the co-author of your book, Alexandra DeSanctis, speak at our July CWN at a panel we had. She did an excellent job. He's been widely published in national newspapers and other publications. He's also the John Paul II Teaching Fellow in Social Thought at the University of Dallas, a great school, a member of the James Madison Society at Princeton University, and a fellow of the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America. He's also a founding editor of Public Discourse, which is the online journal of the Witherspoon Institute at Princeton, New Jersey. He was at the Heritage Foundation for 9 years as a fellow, the William E. Simon Senior Research Fellow. He also served as an adjunct professor of philosophy and political science at Christendom College and a visiting fellow at the Veritas Center at Franciscan University. And that's only part of it, but I'll just stop there. What an incredible resume. He got his Bachelor of Arts from Princeton. He was a Phi Beta Kappa and magna cum laude, and he earned his doctoral degree in political philosophy from the University of Notre Dame. Ryan is married with 3 children, and he told me he has many other kids, including goats, sheep, cows. He lives with his family on a beautiful farm out in Northern Virginia. And after his remarks, we'll do some Q&A, and then we can talk informally at lunch. So please join me in welcoming Ryan Anderson.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. As was mentioned, I spent almost a decade at Heritage, and so I always saw the Conservative Women's Network events going on, and I never felt that I could go because I wasn't a conservative woman. Had I waited long enough, I could have identified as a woman and then just wait my turn. What I want to talk about this afternoon is kind of taking stock of the past 5 years, because a decade ago, none of us knew what the T meant in LGBT. It was the kind of the forgotten letter in that acronym. It was only 15 years ago that the first pediatric gender clinic opened its doors. Right? So it's 2007 that Boston Children's Hospital opens the first pediatric gender clinic. That's largely under the radar. 2012, President Obama still said he believed marriage was the union of a man and a woman. And so while we've been debating gay marriage for a decade at that point, We didn't really have a debate about gender identity or transgender or any of those things. And then all of a sudden, as soon as the left knew that Anthony Kennedy was going to redefine marriage in Obergefell, Bruce Jenner, as he was then called, went on 2020 with Diane Sawyer and said, I'm a woman now. And then a couple months later, you had the cover image on Vanity Fair where it says, "Call me Caitlin." And then all of a sudden, the Obama administration was saying the word sex now means gender identity. And now President Biden says that transgender rights are the human rights issue of our generation. Where did this all come from? What's the consequence? How do we kind of take stock of the harms? That's more or less what I want to focus on, and more so taking stock of the harms. I think it would be a much longer conversation, and it would take us through several hundred years of history about where did this all come from? How far back do you want to go in terms of the roots of the problem? But I do want to kind of catalog some harms. But before doing that, I should mention I like starting with setting the table in the sense of prior to the past 5 to 10 years of the pediatric craze with gender dysphoria, the most common types of gender dysphoria were little boys, prepubertal boys who didn't quite feel boyish enough, so they were identifying as a girl or somehow rejecting a male identity, or middle-aged men. And the most common type here is what the phrase was autogynephilia. So 3 different Greek words: auto, self, gyna, woman, philia, love of self as a woman. And you had various middle-aged men who became the type of woman that they themselves were attracted to, or that they thought other people would be attracted to. And those were the 2 most common forms of gender dysphoria. In the 1960s, Johns Hopkins Hospital opened one of the first gender clinics in America, and they were doing surgeries on those middle-aged men. And then in the 1970s, Dr. Paul McHugh shut it down. He said this was a form of medical malpractice, that these were individuals that had he was the chair of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins. He was the psychiatrist in chief at the hospital, chair of the Department of Psychiatry at the medical school. He said this is cooperating with someone's false understanding of themselves, thinking that there's a surgical solution. He wrote a great essay back in 2004 for the magazine First Things titled "Surgical Sex," explaining why he had shut this down back in the 70s. We now have something new under the sun. Right? Because it's not, though, and actually before I move on to something new in the sun, then the best statistics we had for those young people with gender dysphoria would be that 80 to 95% of the time, if you just leave them alone, give them time and space to continue growing and maturing, they're going to reconcile with their body. A stage of gender confusion would naturally resolve itself. They will then reconcile their identity with reality if you just leave them alone. We now know for adults who identify as transgender, 41% attempt suicide at some point in their lives. And for adults who have had surgical reassignment, best studies we have suggest somewhere around 19% greater likelihood of dying by suicide. That's a tragic set of statistics, knowing that ordinarily 80 to 95% of the time a young person would grow out of this discomfort, and that for adults who seek to live as the opposite sex, roughly half, 41% attempt suicide, and then there's a 19 times greater likelihood of death by suicide, which suggested to me that, we shouldn't do anything to, rush young people into embracing a false sexual identity, right? This should have urged caution. I started working on the When Harry Became Sally book right after the Bruce Jenner interview, because that Sunday morning I was on This Week with George Stephanopoulos, supposedly to talk about the Obergefell case. And the night before, I got a text message from his producer saying, "Can you also talk about the transgender interview from last night?" And I had no idea. I was at a rehearsal dinner for a friend's wedding. When I got the text message, I was at the actual wedding reception. I had to go home and watch the interview streaming to know what to talk about the next morning. But that's when I first noticed this is where the activists are going. They know they're going to win on the marriage question. They're going to pivot from the LGB to the T part of the acronym. And I had the freedom. I'm no longer at Heritage. I loved my time at Heritage. Heritage, so long as I told the truth, didn't cook any data, didn't manipulate the facts, they weren't going to fire me, right? So the famous American political philosopher Janis Joplin once said that freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose. I had nothing left to lose after, having spent 5 years working on the LGB part of the acronym. And so I started researching. It's how the book came out back in 2018. And then it was in 2021 that Amazon decided to disappear the book. relevant to point out what happens in January of 2021 in terms of who's controlling the government and who might be launching a DOJ investigation as to why and when they disappear the book. All right, there is something new under the sun, though. What we're now seeing is a 4,400% explosion in young women and girls identifying as transgender, or more commonly, identifying as non-binary, identifying as gender fluid. This is the phenomenon that just a year or two after my book came out, an excellent book by Abigail Schreier titled Irreversible Damage documented this reality. It's what Lisa Lippman, a professor at Brown University, coined the phrase rapid onset gender dysphoria. This isn't like the prepubertal boys with a gender identity struggle. This isn't like the middle-aged men. This is high school girls, college-age women just opting out of womanhood, rejecting their female identity, and then frequently undergoing irreversible damage. People who should know better are telling them that their path to happiness is testosterone, their path to happiness are double mastectomies. And then more and more we're seeing young women speak out who have regretted this. It was very hard to find people willing to speak out 5 years ago. Now there are courageous young women who share the story of, going on testosterone at age 16, 17, having a double mastectomy, and then in their mid-20s regretting it. All right, so with that, let me just kind of give you a brief outline of kind of what I'm going to say moving forward. I want to give you 7 specific areas of how this effort to kind of erase women, this effort to deny our embodiment as male and female causes harm. It causes harm to everyone. But you'll notice that women tend to bear the brunt of this harm, right? The distribution of who benefits and who suffers from the current kind of gender identity craze disproportionately falls on the shoulders of actual women. So the 7 areas: first, privacy; second, safety; third, equality; fourth, liberty; fifth, family; sixth, bodily integrity; and then 7th, ideology. And I'll just say a few words about each, and then we'll save some time for Q&A. First, there are privacy harms here. There are reasons why at most places of work, at all schools, we have separate facilities for boys and girls, for men and women. We don't always have separate physics classes or chemistry classes, but we do have separate bathrooms, separate locker rooms, separate shower facilities, because we deserve a certain modicum of privacy when we're engaged in intimate bodily functions, when we're in states of undress. And you can see the distinction here with race. To our great shame, we once segregated bathrooms and drinking fountains and other facilities based on skin color. And then when we passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we got rid of that. We said that's discrimination on the basis of race, because our skin color is irrelevant to what we do in a bathroom, what we do in a locker room, what we do in a shower. When we passed Title IX, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex, we didn't get rid of separate male and female bathrooms or male and female locker rooms or male and female shower facilities. We actually created many additional female facilities in order to have equality. Right? Many schools that only had a men's locker room, they didn't even have female athletic programs. They were told they had to create equal opportunity for women. And equality didn't mean sameness. Right? The outcome here wasn't we're just going to have a co-ed, anyone goes into the locker room, bathroom, shower. We would have privacy, because part of recognizing equality was recognizing the differences that make a difference. Skin color differences don't make a difference when it comes to privacy. Bodily differences, sexual differences make a difference. So that's one area of harm, privacy. And look, it's disproportionate. Most guys have no problem with a woman in their locker room. Most women don't want a man in their locker room. Right? We should take sex differences seriously there as well. It's why so many trans women, men who transition to identify as women, say, what's the big deal? Right? Because again, their actual bodily realities suggest that they would be more inclined to not thinking it's a big deal. Actual women think it's a big deal to have a guy in their private facility. All right, second concern is safety, right? Because there's an additional reason why we have these separate facilities. It's that the vast majority of sex crimes are perpetrated by men, and the vast majority of sex crime victims are women. And so we try to provide separate facilities to provide safety. Let me say right up front, this isn't to say that people who identify as transgender are more likely to commit sex crimes. It's to say men are more likely to commit sex crimes. And if you allow a man on his say-so to say, I'm a woman, and to enter a women's only facility, you're more likely to create conditions where there will be victims. And already you're seeing this happen. It was about a year and a half ago now, if I remember correctly, that California said, for our prisons, we're going to do it based on gender identity. There were vastly more men who asked to be transferred to the lady jails than women who asked to be transferred to the male jails. And then several months later, there were women who were pregnant because they had been sexually assaulted in jail. We're seeing this also. Homeless shelters are being sued because they won't allow, in one case, Anchorage, Alaska, an intoxicated man showed up at midnight wearing a nightgown, identifying as a woman, and the Christian homeless battered women's shelter, right? It wasn't just a general shelter. It was a women's shelter, caught up a taxi, paid his taxi fare, sent the man to the men's homeless shelter. They're being sued under a non-discrimination ordinance. And what it was like is, imagine like a cot every 3 feet, right? It's not like a night at the Ritz-Carlton. You're staying in a gymnasium with a bed every couple of feet. It's understandable for both privacy and safety reasons why those women wouldn't want to have a man sleeping that close. There's also a physical concern when it comes to athletics. There's a really good amicus brief that a sports physiologist wrote in one of the cases. I believe it was the New England track athlete cases. But what he was just pointing out is that, like, it's not a result of just your testosterone level, which is why, going on estrogen, reducing your testosterone doesn't make a difference for the bodily changes that took place when you went through male puberty. Your height, your wingspan, your musculature, your lung capacity, all of those things don't change when you then make various cosmetic differences to identify as a woman. And there are safety concerns here when you're actually playing a contact sport, right? If both a high school boy and a high school girl go up for a rebound and they collide, that male body, that male set of shoulders, that male wingspan is going to do a lot more damage to the female body than vice versa. And you see this when you look at the actual scientific studies on who gets concussions, even something like soccer, when two athletes just go to head the ball, women are more likely to suffer concussions than men. The bodies are different. There's a reason why we separate athletic competitions based on sex, but we don't separate or segregate athletic competitions based on race any longer, right? Thank God. Like, we do have a shameful legacy there. When we banned discrimination on both race and sex, we said no to the separating by race. We did not say no to separation by sex because of the safety concern. Third area, an equality concern. Even if you're not playing a contact sport, right? So those Connecticut track athletes or the UPenn swimmers, it's unfair to have men competing in female athletics, right? There were women who had trained all of their lives who were denied a spot at the podium because a mediocre male swimmer who was now identifying as a woman was winning gold medals, was athlete of the year. Right? It's like utterly ridiculous. Knowing somewhat about that situation itself, it was also unfair that the female athletes at Penn were told they had to share a locker room and a common shower area with their teammate, and that they were told to not complain about it, right? So it's a variety of ways in which, female swimmers at other schools who, lost races to the UPenn athlete, the actual females in the UPenn women's team who had to share the locker room, a variety of ways in which, who bears the burdens and who benefits is disproportionate. All right, so that's the third area. So we've gone through privacy, safety, equality. Third area is liberty. And here it's probably more of an equal opportunity offender and who's going to have their liberty violated. But I'll mention three different areas for liberty. One is speech, right? There have been several, both high school teachers, college professors, in one case a kindergarten gym teacher, who have lost their jobs, either because they've spoken out criticizing the transgender ideology, or because they said, I'm just not going to use a false pronoun. I'm not going to misgender one of my students, so I'm not going to speak in a way that makes that student feel uncomfortable, but I'm also not going to speak in a way that's untruthful. That part of my role as a teacher, as a professor, is to actually embody truthfulness for all of my other students, right? It's not good for all of my other students to hear me referring to a male student as Miss So-and-so because they'll think I believe that he's now a she. Some of these professors also point out it's not good for that student himself, right? The student's looking for affirmation from me because I'm an authority figure. And so if I start affirming a mistaken identity, he will read into that my approval, right? It's why they seek to use preferred pronouns. So one is just speech codes, right? Will we be forced? Will you be forced? Will anyone be forced to speak in a way that they believe is false? In New York City, under their Human Rights Act, you could be fined $250,000 for intentionally misgendering someone at the workplace. And I fear that after the Bostock decision, we're actually going to be seeing more of that, since that was specifically on Title VII, our employment non-discrimination law. All right, so one question there is just like, how are we going to speak? The next two deal with medicine. So first, will there be mandates to pay for, to cover, and to perform bad medicine? And so right now, we're in the middle of a rulemaking process from the Biden administration, Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act. And what happened is when Congress passed Obamacare, they said no discrimination on the basis of sex. Then in 2016, the Obama administration, Department of Health and Human Services, said that word sex actually means gender identity. And then they issued a regulation saying that all healthcare plans regulated by Obamacare would have to cover sex reassignment procedures. They'd have to pay for sex reassignment procedures, and relevant physicians would have to perform them. Otherwise, they would be violating the non-discrimination ordinance. The Trump people came into office, they undid that regulation, and now the Biden people are in the process of reinstating it. And I believe just this morning there's a federal court ruling on this question. And so it's possible that, before the Biden people could even finalize the regulation, the courts will have said no. But what's at stake here is this is kind of like the contraception mandate in Obamacare, all over again, but involving like steroids and surgeries. So that if you're a healthcare plan, the way this would work, why they claim it's discrimination, if you're an employer and your healthcare plan covers double mastectomies in the case of breast cancer, but it doesn't cover double mastectomies in the case of transition, including pediatric transition, there were no age limits on this, then you would be discriminating on the basis of sex. Likewise, if you're the physician, right? I mean, let's say you're the physician who performs hysterectomies or mastectomies in the case of cancer. You're the physician who performs hormone therapies in the case of low hormones of your bodily sex, right? So a man with low testosterone, you would also have to do it for the woman who wants to identify as a man. Right? There are hospitals currently being sued by the ACLU and other activist groups, in particular Catholic hospitals are the ones that I'm most familiar with in these cases, because they refused to do a hysterectomy on a woman who wanted to identify as a man. The 1557 regulation had no religious liberty exemptions, no conscience protections, and no considerations simply for best medical judgment. Right? And so liberty here, like there's a religious liberty concern. Some people who are concerned about transgender medicine object on religious grounds. There's a conscience aspect here. I know lots of people who are not religious who have objections to this. And so there's a conscience, there's a moral component to this. There's also just a best medical judgment aspect, right? So some people think it's okay for Bruce to be Caitlin. They think it's okay for adults to transition, but they don't think it's okay for children to transition, right? They draw different lines than I would, for example. This wouldn't do anything for them either, right? If you're going to do it at all, you have to do it for everyone. So nothing even for best medical judgment, allowing individual doctors to think what's in the best interest of this individual patient, right? So we're taking a medical debate and then we're trying to settle it with a very blunt object, a civil rights law, right? Trying to say that this would be the functional equivalent of you as a doctor saying, if you have cancer, I'm not going to perform chemotherapy if you're a woman. Or I won't perform chemotherapy if you identify as a woman. That's radically different than a doctor who says, I don't actually think it's in your best interest for me to remove your healthy breast tissue, especially not at age, fill in the blank, right? But all of that would be considered discrimination under Section 1557 as reinterpreted by both the Obama and Biden administrations. Last aspect of liberty is, will good medicine be prohibited? So I believe the count now is 21 states plus the District of Columbia ban what they call conversion therapy. for minors. And by conversion therapy, they mean you are converting a child's true gender identity. If the child identifies as a girl and you try to help him identify as a boy, right? Or vice versa. Let's say you have a high school girl who's identifying as non-binary or identifying as gender fluid or identifying as a boy, and you try to help that high school girl actually feel comfortable in her own body, that's considered conversion therapy. Because according to the ideology, the true gender identity is non-binary or gender fluid or male, and what you're trying to do is convert the child. By contrast, if you gave that young lady testosterone or a mastectomy or anything else, that would be considered affirmation. Right? So it's an Orwellian abuse of language that actually affirming someone's real reality, their actual embodiment as a woman, is considered conversion. But trying to surgically and chemically transform that young lady into a man or into a non-binary person is considered affirmation. And if you're a parent of a young person and you live in one of these 21 states, it can be very hard for you to find support, professional assistance in helping your child feel comfortable in his or her own body. All right, which leads to number 5. So we've gone through privacy, safety, equality, liberty, now family concerns. Transgender ideology, especially over the past 5 to 10 years, has just torn apart families. It's been devastating. I would say the most difficult conversations I've ever had in my life. Not difficult to have the conversation, but just being there, listening emotionally, were with parents who went along with their teenage daughter's transitions at first because the medical experts told them this is in your daughter's best interest. And if you aren't particularly well read, you haven't done the research yourself, you go to the major university hospital at your hometown, and the doctor in the white coat says, "Oh, put your daughter on puberty blockers, put your daughter on testosterone. It's time for the surgery." And you're like, "Well, doctor knows best." And then 2, 3, 4 years later, the parents realize the mistake they made. It's utterly heartbreaking. Many of those relationships then lead to estranged children. Many parents who I've spoken with have said that it feels like their child joined a cult. Many describe it as part of an online phenomenon, that they find an entirely new identity and friend group and underlying kind of like worldview through social media, through chat groups, through text message groups, things like this, and the parents can't break through. It also has problems when your middle-aged dad comes out as your second mom. And you'll remember this, that when Bruce became Caitlin, the youngest daughter, vocalized some concerns, and then she was shamed on social media, saying that she was transphobic and she was not accepting of her father, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a variety of ways in which gender ideology has harmed families. So 2 more, number 6 and then number 7, bodily integrity and ideology, and then we can open things up for questions. First thing to say on bodily integrity is that sex reassignment's impossible. Right? Sex can't be reassigned, and it's never a good idea to try to do what's impossible and to try to live in accordance with something that's not reality. And I think this is true for children just as much as adults. Right? So I don't think it's a good idea for Bruce to try to live as Caitlin. Insofar as a legal matter, we have to say that adults and children are treated differently under the law, and Bruce is free to make his own mistakes. I might be willing to bite my lip on that, but certainly when it comes to kids, right? Part of what the law does is at least protect a certain amount of time and space before we allow anyone, including parents, to cause irreversible damage to their kids. I don't think we should target parents on this. I think we should target the medical practitioners who are doing this. Right? Because as I mentioned just previously, I think many of the parents are secondary victims in this case, right? Because they're being lied to by the medical establishment. And I think it's an entirely appropriate role for the government, for the state. I'm a conservative. I'm a limited government conservative. This is one of those limited purposes of government. It's to prevent young people from harm at the hands of adults. And I think the surgeons who are performing double mastectomies on 13-year-old girls should be losing their medical licenses. I think the hospitals that allow this should be losing all government funding, if not just directly ban it. Right? I think it's entirely appropriate. what Florida recently did with their Board of Public Health, holding hearings on this to then issue regulations on this. Alabama passed a law that's now in litigation. I think the Florida way of going about it is probably going to be more successful given the mire of courts. But I think it's entirely appropriate for lawmakers to figure out what is the best way of doing this in our given situation, because there's harm to bodily integrity, right? It's harm for everyone. The law might only want to address it as it applies to minors for prudential reasons, but at the very least, we have to be able to say that until you're age 18, no adult should block your natural puberty. I haven't mentioned puberty blockers yet, but puberty blockers are a huge problem here. It's not FDA approved for this treatment. Puberty blockers were tested and then approved for a condition known as precocious puberty, the early onset of puberty. Some kids will go through puberty a couple of years too soon. There's a medication that you can take that would then pause puberty until a year or two later when it's biologically appropriate to go through puberty. What they're now doing is they're using this drug off-label without FDA approval to just indefinitely block puberty, so that a young person who's going through a stage of gender confusion would never develop biologically the way that their body is intended to. And on that, we have no idea what the long-term consequences are. There's not a single study on what the long-term consequences are, and not just to our sexual development. Sexual development happens at puberty, but all sorts of interconnected, interrelated, coordinated bodily developments take place. You hit your growth spurt, your voice deepens, various muscular development takes place, bone development, bone density, and a whole host of psychological brain development takes place. And these children are being used as guinea pigs. And this is particularly concerning where we see that for other people, Lupron is one of the drugs that's used. It's led to things like bone fragility. It's led to other kind of physical bodily harms. And we're using it for young people. Parents are told, would you rather have a living son or a dead daughter? Right? That's the blackmail that doctors are using over parents when it comes to puberty blockers, testosterone surgery. Parents are also told that the puberty blockers are just a pause button. This is just to give your child time and space to continue developing. They're told that it's fully reversible. In reality, what we know is that virtually 100% of children placed on puberty-blocking drugs go on to cross-sex hormones. It's a one-way ratchet, and it makes sense. Why? If you already feel dysphoric, right, you don't feel comfortable in your own body, and then all of your classmates go through their normal biological puberty, right? So the boys get taller, they get more muscular, their voice deepens, the girls, they start having their period, their breasts develop, and you do neither, right? And you already, let's say you're a high school girl, doesn't feel comfortable, and you're saying, well, wait, I feel more dysphoric. If you're that boy, I feel more dysphoric, right? Which is why the clinical studies that we have on this, they're all short-term, show that the young people who go on puberty blockers more or less universally then go on cross-sex hormones, right? So it's not a pause button, it's a one-way ratchet. And then the other thing is when they say that, well, if you go off them, it's fully reversible, we have no idea if that's true. First of all, we just don't know if you go off of them, will normal puberty recommence. But then secondly, you don't actually reverse the years of not going through development by going through development later in life. It was a medical doctor, professor, a friend of mine who pointed this out to me. He said, look, if you're supposed to go through a developmental process at age 12, but you end up going through it at age 18, you haven't reversed the 6 years of blocking it. And we also don't know what it's like to develop physically 6 years too late. Right? It's entirely experimental. So harms to bodily integrity. I'll add here that I think you could add both bodily and social integrity. I think social transition is problematic. I think it's harmful for children. So even before you get to any medicinal process, to tell a young boy that he's actually a girl, to give him a new name, a new pronoun, a new wardrobe, is itself a way of harming that child's own understanding of who he is. And most people who socially transition will now go on to puberty blockers and then cross-sex hormones, right? So it's not as if it's you're just giving your child time. Whereas what we used to do for children with gender dysphoria is that we did just give them time, We're like, look, don't force on them any stereotypical activities. If your boy wants to play with Barbie, that's fine. But you don't have to tell your boy that he's now a girl, right? And so that leads to the seventh area of harm that I want to mention, the ideology aspect of this. Because what's at stake here is, what all people will be taught about human nature and human identity, particular harms to people who struggle with their gender identity. But I think this actually harms the entire culture when your understanding of sex is it's something that's chosen, or it's something that's created, or it's something that you discover. They're actually contradictory accounts coming from kind of like transgender ideologues as to whether it's something that you create, a performative theory of gender with Judith Butler, or is it something that you discover, your inner sense of gender? Some people want to embrace both of these things, even though they're contradictory. I mean, there's a whole host of metaphysical, philosophical contradictions at the heart of this. But that changes everyone's understanding of what it is to be a boy and a girl, right? Not just the people struggling with dysphoria. I think it's particularly harmful to girls because what we're seeing is that it's trading on all of the sex stereotypes that the feminists of the past 50 years fought against, right? So the idea here is that if you are a young boy and you like Pink and Barbie and ballet, that means you're a girl trapped in a boy's body. And by contrast, if you're a girl who doesn't like any of those things, maybe that means you're a boy trapped in a girl's body, or you're non-binary, or you're gender fluid. I think it's not happenstance that the 4,400% increase that the UK's gender clinic saw, the Tavistock Clinic, was of young, high school and college age girls and women identifying as boys or non-binary. Our culture is probably more inhospitable to young women than at any other time kind of in recent, or let's just limit it to like American history, right? The unrealistic expectations that women are told they're supposed to fulfill, the Barbie doll image of what a real woman is supposed to look like. To my mind, it's not surprising that we have both the Me Too revelations and rapid onset gender dysphoria happen more or less at the same time. That women who want to opt out of unrealistic cultural and social expectations that are being placed on them are opting out by identifying as non-binary or gender fluid. And then I think, and high school, going through puberty to latter part of middle school, high school, that's a difficult stage for most people, right? Even in the best of circumstances, kind of like growing up from a child into an adult is a pathway that needs to be navigated with care. And when I was in high school, people who kind of struggled with that pathway identified as goth, right? They painted their fingernails black, they wore black trench coats, et cetera, et cetera. And then a year or two later, they look back, that was a silly stage. There was no irreversible damage, right? For now, the concern is that people struggling with their identities, struggling as they develop, they can latch on to the transgender label, the transgender identity, as a form of escaping. Another researcher, I can't remember who, had pointed out that if you also live in a identity politics, victim politics culture, which is what we live in, you immediately move to the top of the pecking order if you come out as non-binary, right? If you're a white, cisgender, heterosexual woman, like the only thing lower than you is the white, cisgender, heterosexual man, right? On kind of like the victimology totem pole. If you then come out as non-binary, even if you don't do, like nothing else changes, you come out as bisexual, for example, like we're seeing an explosion in high school and college age LGBT identification, but it's largely the bisexual part and it's the gender non-binary part. And it seems to be one suggestion, we don't really know any of this because it's such a new phenomenon, but one suggestion is it's a way of kind of escaping a difficult developmental stage. And then the concern is that unlike the goth identity that, a couple years later, you just take off the trench coat, you paint your nails some other color, you don't paint them at all, whatever, this actually leaves harm, right? And we're increasingly hearing those stories. Actually, Kelsey is with us. I mean, how many now documentaries have you made documenting young women in particular? If you don't know, Kelsey Harkness is Independent Women's Forum, and I don't know, is it like half a dozen? I mean, this goes back to Daily Signal videos you made too. So there's a lot. Just Google Kelsey's name and YouTube, and you can see a number of just heartbreaking interviews with people who have suffered in this way. All right, so with that, I'm gonna stop, and I stuck right to schedule. We have exactly 15 minutes for Q&A, and the floor is open. You know, it's depressing. Yes. I think they're gonna bring a mic.
Oh, great. Hi, Brian. I'm Ginny Gentles. I work with Kelsey at the Independent Women's Forum. And you used the word transphobic, I think, just once.
Yep.
I get called transphobic. I'm sure Kelsey does, too. I'm sure you have years and years of being called that.
Amazon has recently informed.
Yeah,
Yes.
my sense of it is that it doesn't hurt my feelings because it's a
Not
meaningless word. I was wondering if you could speak to what that word is used for
Yep.
and how we can kind of get around the idea of being afraid of speaking up about this issue and being called a meaningless word.
Yes, great question. So, I mean, I think that the way that this originally was coined, it's part of like the label homophobic, was that there are people who literally had a phobia, like they were afraid of gay people. Now, I don't actually think very many people actually had like a phobia of gay people, but it was a helpful way of trying to say that, you know, what might be a moral disagreement or a theological disagreement is really just a form of your own psychological hangup, right? So they pathologized what should have been like an actual like exchange of ideas by saying one side of that debate has a pathology. They have a phobia, right? Like you know, a fear of spiders. You have a fear of gay people. And then I think the playbook that was successful with the same-sex marriage debate has just been replicated, right? And so if we can label our opposition not as reasonable people who have well-grounded concerns about our ideology, but as bigots and haters and people who have a fear. And that's the second part, because it's not just that you had a pathological fear of an individual, but that fear is actually what's now motivating your hatred, right? So it's not just that you disagree with me about what the nature of marriage is. You hate me because I am gay. You hate me because I am trans. I mean, that's how they want to, and it's a very effective way of silencing people. I mean, I think the three of us are somewhat unique, and you know, it no longer bothers us if it ever did. But many people, especially if you have an entirely kind of normal professional vocation, you're a banker, you're a CPA, you're a coach, you know, to be called a transphobic bigot is a kind of scary phenomenon, right? I mean, imagine, would any of you want to be called a racist? Right? And already, because they over-accuse people of being a racist, that is not as powerful of a charge as it once was. But a decade ago, if you were publicly accused of racism, that was a scary place to be, right? Because then it's like, well, how do you deny it? Like, here's my black friend. Like, you can't really prove a negative, right? And I think something similar was successful on the gay marriage debate. It was successful in the early stages of the transgender debate. I think a lot of people, including, I think, to their great shame, religious leaders said, well, we lost the gay marriage debate. We're going to lose the trans debate, so we're just not going to speak out. And you could identify whole congregations, whole like institutions that had been vocal in the former, and then they went silent on the latter. And I think out of fear of the criticism. And now what we're seeing is that like some of the most outspoken critics of this disagree with us on like everything else. Right? If this is a conservative network, they disagree with us about abortion, disagree with us about marriage, disagree with us about taxes, trade, whatever, but they agree with us that sex is real. And I think it's really been wonderful that they have the courage to speak out, but it's been shameful how people who should have known better and should have been willing to speak out refuse to. And you know, again, I mean, to its great credit, when I was at Heritage, they let me do the book. It wasn't always without some teeth pulling, and there weren't but you know, it got done, and they stood behind it, right? And there were other conservative institutions, other religious institutions that just went silent. So that said, don't go silent. That is the left's playbook on how they win on this, right? The left wins on this not because they actually win a rational argument, a rational debate, but that they intimidate their critics by calling them names so that they censor themselves. Right? And then they get YouTube to censor your videos, they get Amazon to censor, like that's all part of it to intimidate other people. Right? I mean, like who wants to write a book now thinking that Amazon might censor it? Right? There's a chilling effect. I think it's failing. I think there's been a Streisand effect actually. right? I mean, this is where you censor someone and then more people learn about it because of the censorship. Book sales were great. The couple of weeks after Amazon delisted the book, people were buying it from Barnes and Nobles directly from the publisher. More people learned about it. Yeah. And so anyway, I think what we can do is use our own voice in speaking out, which then gives courage to other people to speak out. And then when people are being unfairly attacked, just mock the label. Like, I love the fact that people, like, when it's a meaningless term, it doesn't mean anything for you to call me a transphobe or whatever and move on. Yeah.
Two things. One, building off of that question and your response, I run into a lot of people in my day-to-day life who are not involved in politics, who kind of are like, yeah, I would never want this to happen to my child. They think they would never let it happen. Little do they know a lot of this is out of their control.
Yes.
But they don't want to tell other people, other parents in their school what to do. And, part of what I do is to try to break through to those people, but we have so much more work to do. So I'm wondering, like, how you think through reaching those types of people. And then also a huge issue here. I've been interviewing parents in addition to these detransitioners, parents whose children fell prey to gender ideology, and they have nowhere to go in terms of finding mental health experts. And I feel so helpless and sorry for them. And like, I've even asked Miriam Grossman,
Yeah.
a well-known psychiatrist on this issue, what to do. And it's like, nobody has an answer.
Yes.
But you do, right?
Well, yes and no. Nothing that I would. So there are people that you could confidentially refer people to, but I can't say any of their names out loud on something that would be on YouTube, because then they would immediately get targeted, right? And so it's almost like on a need-to-know basis. And there are kind of underground networks of therapists. Sometimes it's going to be through telehealth because they don't live in your neighborhood, right? And but there are kind of like gender critical mental health professionals who you know in a couple of places, and then the rest has to be done. And like there's a supply and demand problem here. There's way too much demand, and there's not nearly enough supply. And partly it's because if you're a physician and you live in one of these states where the conversion therapy laws, you say to yourself, I just can't practice medicine on this area. Right? And so it's been a chilling effect for practitioners. I think it's a great need. I mean, I think it would actually be really good for, I think it would have to be either conservative or Christian medical schools or kind of like residency programs that would specialize in training a generation of mental health professionals on how to counsel on these issues. And I know some groups are working on that. But again, like as soon as you publicly draw attention to it, moles start applying to the school program, lawsuit. I mean, and so it's a terrible legal situation to be in. Remind me briefly the first part of the question. Oh, normal people. Yes, yeah. I mean, so I think like for normal people, like it's actually your documentaries are much more effective than like a presentation like this, right? Storytelling is a much better way of reaching people who aren't particularly political, aren't particularly ideological, aren't particularly like focused on this. If you can get people to watch, just a 5-minute video that you've made, and then you say, wait a minute, like you claim to love your neighbor. You claim to be the type of liberal who thinks that like we should actually be doing what's in the best interest of our neighbors, and you're just going to turn a blind eye to this. I mean, I think there is some hypocrisy would be too strong of a word, but there is like a double standard where it's frequently people on the political left side of the spectrum who think that there is a role for the state in social welfare programs and public spending for the poor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, who think there is something that we should do. We are our neighbor's keeper. And then on this issue, all of a sudden they become libertarian, right? And I think there's a it's I think it's a lack of courage, just to put a label to it. And I think sometimes the way that courage would be gained would actually be seeing what the bad consequences could be. Right? It's sometimes it's easier to see evil than to see good, And like when the evil is like right in front of your face, it actually clarifies for you what the good is that you should be seeking. But I think it's hard. I'm very grateful that you're making these videos though, because like they're not going to read my books. They're not going to watch, when this lecture is published on YouTube, they're not going to watch that. But they might see your video on Twitter, on Facebook. Someone might text it to them. And like, that's a good way of reaching people.
Hi,
Hey.
my name is Linda Kendall, and I live in Fairfax, and I'm very interested in this topic as it relates to education, since we were having school board elections coming up. So thank you for all the research that you've done. I'm curious as to, in your research, can you pinpoint or give a theory of what the genesis of this move to towards transgenderism is? So that'd be question number one. And number two, it's hard. It's not that I'm a conspiracy theorist, or maybe I am, but but what is
As
your...
we just learned from Twitter last night, sometimes conspiracies are actually going on. Yes.
Well, what is your theory of who is behind it in terms of, is it government, pharma, et cetera? Because
Yep.
because we do see that hand, for example, in the COVID vaccine introduction, how they were pushing the medical,
Yep. Yeah. No, I got your question. It's a great question. So this is what I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk, that, if we were going to do like, where did this come from? We could, spend a couple hours going back all the way to like medieval mistakes in philosophy with nominalism and voluntarism. But I would say the more proximate answers, well, I mean, so I would say one is technology. Prior to the creation of synthetic sex hormones and various forms of surgery, it would have been laughable if I said, I'm going to live as a woman. Right? It wasn't technologically feasible. There was no way I could pass as a woman. But now, with synthetic estrogen, with surgeries, both to kind of transform like the genital area of my body, but also they can like soften my knuckles. They can reduce the size of my knuckles. They can soften my jawline, electrolysis for my I mean, like, it's actually amazing, in a scary way, like how many different procedures someone could undergo to cosmetically transform themselves to appear as, a stereotypical woman. So part it's technology, I would say. Part is definitely political. The timing of this, when and where it pops up, this was not a grassroots phenomenon of soccer moms, right? This was not like ordinary parents wanting this for their kids. This was, you had well-funded LGBT organizations, and they had a 20-year struggle for the redefinition of marriage. They knew they were going to win in 2015 when Obergefell, and then they pivoted from the LGB to the T part of the acronym, right? Left-wing activist groups, they don't like declare victory, shut down, send the money back to their donors. They just move on to the next thing, right? It's a rolling revolution. And I think, you have to see that dynamic of like, the timing of this, it's political. Two more things. It's ideological. There are true believers. There are people who really believe that they are helping people. And I think that's sad, right? They're deeply mistaken, but there are people who really believe this. There are other people who are motivated to believe this. They want to live in the type of universe where we are each self-creators. They don't want to live in the type of universe where there are the laws of nature and nature's God. Right? That's not how they want the world to be. They want the world to be one in which we create our own identities, and therefore we can refashion our bodies. Right? And so some of this is the transhumanism. Yeah, I mean, some of it's going to be kind of cultural Marxism, but there's ideology, either kind of like sincere with, I really believe this is helping, or I really believe that this is the type of world that we should live in. Right? And then the last thing, there's definitely a profit motive here. If you transition someone, if you remove their natural kind of sex hormone producing organs, you've just created a lifelong patient. Even if they detransition, right, they're never going to be able to produce their natural bodily sex hormones. So one way or the other, they're seeing a doctor every couple of months. if you do various surgeries, there's a tragic New York Times op-ed by a man who says, I identify as a woman. Next week, I want my surgery. My body is always going to be trying to close my neovagina because my body's going to think it's a wound. It was Andrea Chu, if I remember correctly, the author's name. And it just, that is the physical reality, right? But from the pharmaceutical company, the surgeries, it's a moneymaker. And especially if you can then get government mandates to pay for it, right? And so it's a variety of factors. I wouldn't say anyone does this just for the money, but if you believe the ideology, the government's telling you have to do it, and you're making money on it, you might not be willing to speak out against it, right? So it may very well be that some of the political and the economic factors contribute to the underlying ideology, and it's given it wings that it otherwise wouldn't have happened. And then none of this would have happened if not for the technology, right? Which is why we don't see this 100 years ago. But I think they stopped doing it because of Matt Walsh's protests, if I understand correctly. But I got an email yesterday from an old friend of mine who I've not been in touch with for a couple of years, and he's a hedge fund guy. And he was like, I was meeting with a hospital about investing, and the hospital, I forget what rank, told me that this is how much money they're making on their transgender surgeries, but the clinical outcomes aren't all that good. And he cited a statistic that I'm not quite sure is accurate, which is why I'm not. But he cited a statistic on what like the suicide rate was, and it was even higher than the one that I cited for you earlier, and yet they continue to do it, right? And it could be that you're motivated to turn a blind eye. And I would say so when you put all those things, the technology, the politics, the money, and the ideology, it can also then create a situation where the young Paul McHugh, right, like his grand student, is saying to him or herself, I can't speak out. I know there are 2 generations now of psychiatrists that McHugh has trained, but they don't feel like they can say anything because they would lose their job. And in fact, one of them did. Dr. Alan Josephson spoke at a heritage event that I hosted about 5 years ago, and he's still in litigation because his university, he was the chair of pediatric psychiatry at the University of Louisville, and ADF is representing him in that unlawful termination lawsuit. And Dr. Josephson was in his 60s when they disposed of him, and it wasn't for him because he was going to be retiring in the near term anyway. It was to send a message to his students. It was to send a message to the 30, 40-year-old psychiatrist that if you speak out, it'll be the end of your academic career. Right? And so I think that's the other dynamic is that like there's a motivation for why you embrace this stuff. There's also motivations that are very real for why some people stay quiet. Yeah. I mean, it's a form of kind of professional coercion that if you would lose your job, like I'm lucky. Like, this is what I mean by the Janis Joplin quote. It's somewhat a joke, but it's true. I have a freedom to say things that many other people don't.
Ryan, hi. Faith McDonald. Incidentally, you talked about churches that were not speaking out. There were some churches that were perpetuating this. I mean, the first time I learned about transgenderism was at the convention of the General Convention of the Episcopal Church, way back, before I ever heard about it in public society. But my question's about prison rape. I was part of the group that worked on the original Prison Rape Elimination Act in Congress. And is there anything being done to prosecute the rapists? Thanks.
Not that I know of, but that doesn't mean that it's not taking place. It just means that since I became president of an organization, I don't have as much time to stay up to date on it's miserable. I mean, like, I shouldn't say it's miserable. It's a different vocation, and I miss my old life where I got to like read a lot, and now I don't. So anyway, a moment of personal therapy. But as a result, so I just don't know, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. I do know of at least one Senate office that is interested in federal legislation on this. But I don't remember the details enough now to tell you what that would look like because there are jurisdictional questions. But it does strike me that you would be violating constitutional rights of both equal protection and due process if you have a state who is incarcerating someone and then putting them in a situation where they are, at elevated risk for violation of one of their constitutional bodily integrity. Yep. Yep. And so there is at least one Senate office that I know of that's looking into this. The problem is nothing's going to happen with. I mean, we can't count to 60 except for gay marriage. I mean, like that's outrageous about this. But yeah. Oh, perfect. Yeah.
Hi, thank
Hi.
you. Very
Yeah.
informative, and I agree with all of your points. But I wanted to fine tune into one. I have 3 friends who are dealing with this issue with their children. One, Jewish, very liberal Democrat, daughter has transitioned to a boy. Then one libertarian, I would say lean right, daughter has become binary or non-binary. And then the third, very hard right conservative whose daughter has become non-binary. And I've had individual conversations with them, and none of these three families know each other, or if they do, I don't know. They don't even live in the same cities. All 3 families, very well-to-do, very successful, and fought hard to get their kids into the best, most elite private schools around them. In all cases, all 3 of these, my friends, have said, I don't want to lose my child. I'm going to support them. And we had have the question, I said, how did we get to this point? He says, I'm not saying it started there, but it was fueled by the teachers in these elite schools. And I know here in Loudoun County, and I mean, this is the heart of the parent movement, but I really think that a lot of this brakes can be held on or stopped if we could somehow get control of our schools and the agenda.
Great question. And what you just touched on was something that was that Kelsey mentioned in her question with the parents who think that they can protect their kids, that they can somehow avoid this. And the reality is that no one can avoid this. It's everywhere. It's in the public schools. It's in the private schools. It's in some of the religious schools. Right? I mean, the question about first hearing this at the Episcopal convention, there's really no escaping it. I think you can probably delay exposure to it, but only if you're going to homeschool. I mean, I don't even know. And even if you homeschool, you can't fully delay exposure because presumably your kids have friends, and you're not going to police each and every friend and their family and what they've been exposed. I mean, so I just don't see a way in which you could just say we're going to contain it. And so then I think one conservative option is to talk about school choice. I love school choice. I think we should do more of it. I think we should start making arguments that there's constitutional rights to educational freedom, that if the law is going to mandate that you have to educate your child, but then it only provides you with one cost-free option and it's ideologically driven, that there are both establishment and free exercise concerns there. Bill Barr, the former attorney general, has made a set of arguments along these lines. And I think that's a promising line to go because as we work politically, Arizona just passed a universal school choice. It's $7,000 of funding. That's not nothing, but it's for many families not enough. But that's Arizona. There are 49 other states. I mean, it's just there's a lot of work to do on school choice. I endorse it, support it. That can't be our only response. Right? I think sometimes conservatives were so focused on school choice that we ignored the government-run institutions where the vast majority of children were educated. And I think this is great. I unfortunately live in Loudoun County. I will never send my kids to the Loudoun County schools. But I love the fact that parents have been engaging. I love the fact people aren't just saying, let me opt out and homeschool or do private school, but actually saying, if we are going to have public institutions, they actually need to reflect some semblance of truth, right? And this is ideology. So anyway, there are a variety of legislative proposals. For example, Heritage has model legislation on not allowing someone to call your child by a different name at school without informing parents. I think it's like the Given Name Act, if I remember correctly. And then you run into a problem that even if that law got enacted, many school districts would ignore it. I mean, that's what we're experiencing right now in Virginia, where Governor Youngkin and his office have said various things need to change. And then the Commonwealth attorneys are like, yeah, we're not going to enforce that law. And then the local school districts are like, yeah, we're not going to abide by that regulation, right? So like the lawlessness is also a huge problem. which is to say, I don't have any quick solutions. I think this is like it's an intractable problem. And what it means is that, like, as citizens, this is something that we need to keep highlighting for our elected representatives. Youngkin wins his governor's race because of two issues: CRT and two girls in Loudoun County bathrooms who were sexually assaulted. Apart from those two things, I don't think he's Governor Youngkin. And we need to, in all of the chattering class, right? All of the consultants want to say, just talk about low taxes and free trade, just talk about the economic issues. And they advise candidates, don't talk about the social or the cultural. The message needs to be the exact opposite, right? Youngkin won not because he was talking about like lowering taxes in Virginia, because he was talking about like sanity when it comes to education in Virginia. That clip from what's his face, where he's like, they're not your children, they're our children, right? That was, McAuliffe, foot and mouth moment. He shot it, but it was an opportunity for Youngkin, and Youngkin leaned into it. Even though I think some of his consultants and his handlers were probably telling him not to lean, right? So he had better instincts than his hangers-ons. So I don't know what the precise solution would be, but I think if you keep highlighting the issue and getting political leadership to acknowledge the issue, then there will be a variety of things that people do. So you look at what Governor DeSantis has done in Florida. Up until third grade, you just can't talk about this stuff. And in Florida, if you actually have people who will enforce the law, I mean, you could actually see change there. A number of teachers have resigned over this bill. That's a good thing, right? If there's a teacher who thinks they need to talk about sexuality with kindergartners, they probably shouldn't be teaching. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over.
Last question.
Oh, right.
if I
There is
may.
one more question. Sorry, yes.
And you've mentioned a couple, DeSantis and Youngkin.
Yep.
Can you give us a few more who have been bold enough?
I can give you some cowards.
And the other issue is the yuck factor. No offense.
Right.
Especially with public figures, it's like, oh my gosh, to talk about like that New York Times story.
Yep.
How important is that? And who else is bold enough to talk about this?
Yeah, so
elected.
Good question. I mean, I do think the yuck factor cuts in the way of conservatives censoring themselves, right? It's conservative politicians saying, I just don't want to have to talk about this stuff one way or the other because it's icky, and I don't want to talk about icky issues, right? And it's not just like there are a variety of social culture things that like they just don't want to have to talk about, right? Kristi Noem is on my list of villains for vetoing that bill that would have protected athletics, and there was no reason to do it. There was nothing wrong with the legislative language. It was, she made up excuses, and I think it was largely because of lobbying from, I can't remember if it was the NCAA or who it was, but did she? Do you guys? I can't remember, but I don't think so. Right, but I think it was all lip service, though. Like, at the moment to sign into law, she betrayed us, and then she realized it was a political misstep, and now she's trying to say, oh, but we could, revise it later on, and the revision hasn't come. There has been some action in Texas that has been good. I think some of it was not implemented in the best ways, but there was a willingness to protect kids from gender ideology. Otherwise, I don't have a long list for you. Oh yeah, but yeah. So I mean, like he's not. I mean, the problem there is that he's one House member and he's in the minority, so there's just like not much that he can get done. But no, Jim Jordan's good on this. There are a variety of Senate offices that have been good on this. Yeah, Holly, I believe Lankford, I believe Cotton, Rubio, Cotton. Yes, Cotton has where it would. I think one of them would extend the statute of limitations, and then one of them is it a parental rights aspect, or is it just the statute of limitations? Statute of limitations. I might. Yeah. So I will stop talking. Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.